Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back again to give you the State of Discipline Priest number 3, where we can go over our tier set bonuses at long last, as well as some of the changes and some of the updates, some of the things that I've really noticed now that we've been able to finally dip our toes into a bit of the raid testing. First and foremost, let's talk about that tier set, okay? They did actually kind of hold true to the idea of having a lot of simpler tier sets, which is great because there's not a whole lot of time left until the expansion drops. So for Discipline, they have this 2 set. When casting Powered Shield, it increases the effectiveness of your next direct damage or healing spell by 10%. The 4 set, Penance, increases the strength of your next shield by 100% of its damage or 30% of its healing. Kind of interesting as well, of being able to have a very meaty, very powerful Penance when we're going into Dragonflight, as there's tons and tons of different Penance modifiers. But it's also important to keep in note that Powered Shield has an incredibly low cooldown at present in Dragonflight Beta. It has like a 6 or 8 second cooldown or something like that, but it gets so heavily reduced by haste that it ends up being like 4 or 5 seconds, and there's cooldown reduction as well when casting Renew through some of the pretty standard talent builds, I would argue, at the moment. You're able to kind of like renew twice and then shield, and then renew twice and then shield, and kind of back and forth very, very quickly and very easily. Now, what's most interesting about the shield build is I think it's incredibly, incredibly great to have in a 5-man environment, because you're a single target healing flash shield because you don't have any Shadowman anymore. It is a massive boon to have some shields that feel powerful, chunky, and good. When it comes to a raiding environment, however, it is pretty disruptive. And the set bonuses themselves are not, I don't think, the root cause of it. I really do think it is shield's super low cooldown that sort of dominates your gameplay in between your ramp sequences. And I'm kind of worried that the 2 set bonus in particular is going to kind of dominate the raid sequences that you're having as well. If you're getting a 10% buff or something like that onto a Mind Games, and you already have Schism up and all these other different modifiers for it, are you going to end up being in some kind of situation where, like, some people have already posted, like, Reglitch on forums saying, hey, you might, like, drop Purge the Wicked cast just to, like, guarantee your shield so that you're going to be able to have your damage buffs going for when you actually need it? Are you going to get to a scenario where it would be better to, like, weave in shields in between your damage or something very strange like that? I hope not. But with shield's super low cooldown at present, it is extremely awkward to be going through it, and the 2 set bonus will increase the damage and healing spells. So if you're going to be casting a bunch of shields before you cast your Radiances, well, you're buffing your Renews or you're buffing your Radiances, and then you'd have to cast a shield before your actual big damaging ability, like a Mind Games or something like that. So do you like Schism, Shield, Mind Games, Penance, or something along those lines to properly benefit from it? Those are some of the questions that I would be most curious about, and hopefully the answer would end up being no. But if it is not the case, then that would mean that you're buffing a bunch of spells before your damage window, which means that the 2 set bonus wouldn't really buff your atonement ramps at all when it comes to that raid-wide healing ability that we're supposed to be known for. So that to me is very frustrating as well to be looking at, and not something I'm super looking forward to for a raiding environment. But for an M+ environment, hey, it's great because I'm casting shield all the time, and I'm casting damage or healing or something else all the time, and I'm always going to be able to find some sort of value out of it. With Penance, oh man, I'm curious with that 4 set bonus, whether you can just have like shields worth somebody's entire health pool because you already have fairly powerful shields, you have Rapture on hand, you have Aegis of Wrath as well. Are you able to just completely cover somebody's health pool thanks to these bonuses? And alternatively, does that mean that you're going to be able to do some incredibly cheesy stuff in a raiding environment to be able to give somebody a near immunity effect, to be able to soak certain mechanics, to be able to have less people on hand to soak because you could then use Rapture and the strength of those shields, as opposed to having the entire raid soak a mechanic? You could have a handful of players with heavy defensives and absorb effects onto them. That's not unheard of either. Anybody who remembers Clarity of Will back in the day knows how powerful it can be to stack up lots and lots of shields. And so even having the every, what, 9-10 second boost to your shields thanks to Penance's damage, and the constant feedback loop that you're getting out of Harsh Discipline, sending multiple bolts into the targets. This could really make for some nutty mechanics and some nutty gameplay around Disc's shields, which could be good or bad depending on your view of the spec over the years. Now, some of the experiences I learned from raid testing. Yes, it is quite disruptive having to cast the shields all the time, but it does feel really good in terms of your ability to spot heal, in terms of your ability to support tank healing, which previously you did very, very little of, and tanks are taking actual damage at the start of expansions, which it can only feel good when you have your shields automatically getting absorbed as you place them, especially when you have a talent like Aegis of Wrath, which is easy to get to, and especially when you're dumping it onto a target that is always taking the damage, you don't have to worry too much about that shield decay effect that the talent actually comes with. In my experiences throughout the bosses, there were some fights like Taros, which were super ridiculously straightforward in terms of like your ramp sequence, when you could ramp, the type of healing that you're going to be able to do. All of those were incredibly straightforward, and then it kind of just comes down to getting used to the fight, getting some timing down, and you'll be able to go. The strategy I was most commonly going with was utilizing Bright Pupil for cooldown reduction for your Radiances, and I was splitting up my ramps so that I would have a mix of a couple shields and some renews, and then double Radiance into, you know, Schism and Light's Wrath, and then Mind Games, so that I would have a Shadow, followed by a Light, followed by a Shadow spell to take advantage of Twilight Equilibrium, to buff by 15% on each of the different sides. That worked out fantastically, dealt great damage, and then I would have more of a standard, you know, Rapture into Evangelism ramp to benefit from the extra atonement duration I would get out of the powered shields. With that extra powered shield duration and everything going on, I would be able to then feed it into Evangelism, and then as followed, still playing around Twilight Equilibrium to alternate between damaging light, damaging shadow spells, to have that 15% damage buff rolling at all times. When it came to that actual talent selection, the talent bonuses, I was actually opting away from Sins of the Many. Based off the latest changes, you don't have to go into Sins of the Many anymore to reach Evangelism, and so what that did is it allowed you to go into things like Twilight Equilibrium, which is buffing primarily your damage during your ramp, so that you're always having a 15% damage buff during your ramp. It allows you to still take Light's Wrath. It allows you to also go all the way down, take Divine Aegis, and take Aegis of Wrath for the extra shielding value. So with the talent setup that I was running with, there was the particular option if I wanted to mess around with having like extra buffs for Light's Wrath, and I opted to not actually go after any of those because Light's Wrath, when I was playing with it, felt incredibly strong on its own. In fact, many times I was able to fully top off the raid, although my timing still needs a little bit of work on some of these fights, as I'm sure that you're going to be able to see. But with that, I'm still able to have massive burst of healing to be able to kind of cover everybody. If it crits, I'm making massive Divine Aegis shields. So overall, Discipline is super powerful down that route. Your spot healing feels really good. Your burst output is great. Being able to alternate between damaging spells with Twilight Equilibrium feels very satisfying and very enjoyable. That being said, the downsides I'd see going forward are still kind of that weird gameplay around Powered Shield having way too low of a cooldown, and it's sort of this thing you have to constantly keep an eye on while you're raiding, to the point that I couldn't really mix in Divine Star or Solace that well, because I feel like I have so many different active spells. So I'm pretty sure you're going to be running with Shield Discipline for most of the expansion at present, because you're getting out a ton of shields. It's super easy to be able to get them to absorb properly. The extended atonement duration that you get right underneath Rapture is super easy to be able to select and just very useful to be able to bring to the table. And this also brings to the point of not having a lot of variance when it comes to Discipline builds. Throughout the past, I don't know, 5-6 years that Discipline has been in this modern version, you're kind of playing the same builds every single time, and there's not a ton of variety to it. And it seems like the set bonuses are also kind of pointing you in that direction as well, which is not too bad of a thing, but it also really highlights how fine of a line that you kind of walk with Disc Priest, and how much you're sort of dependent on some very straightforward talents and some very specific talent options to be able to properly make the most of the spec. It's a very interesting talents. namely the Inescapable Torment, I believe it is. It used to be Shadowflame Prism. For example, we don't really have the opportunity to mess around with that because it's capped at atonement on 1 target, even though it's hitting a maximum of 5. You're not really having any sort of scenarios where you're going to be able to min-max or play around with that. I was debating between whether I wanted to run Bender or Shadow Fiend, and I was kind of playing around with some of the different options there with the talent points. Some of the other options and things like Expiation, the actual consumption of your dots feels really mediocre, but when you're able to get into execute phase and have some of your ramps where you can double tap Shadow or Death back to back, or I guess you could like Shadow or Death, cast a light spell, and then cast Shadow or Death again, so you properly balance it with Twilight Equilibrium. Feels so satisfying, and I cannot wait to be able to utilize that on progression, because the healing is fantastic that you're getting. It feels very powerful, and you might want to invest in the damage reduction component in your class tree to kind of reduce some of the Shadow or Death damage, as I have murdered myself in the past with Shadow or Death, and I could definitely see myself doing it again when I can mash it twice very, very quickly to yield more atonement output. I will say the spec feels decently mobile when you're able to shield cast all the time and you're not so hell-bent on just min-maxing smite super hard. It does feel, in terms of the active spells, with keeping up your dots, with using shield on cooldown, making sure you have some atonements and out as you're going to be utilizing like offensive penance almost all the time. Even though defensive penance does feel a lot better, it does feel like there's a lot of different abilities, a lot of different conflict at work for the spec. And I think the easiest point that could just be pinned and fixed and alleviated for the spec would definitely be increasing the cooldown of Power Word Shield, so that other areas sort of have room to breathe and room to grow and everything like that. On the class tree, I messed around with some Power Word Life. Again, with how active your abilities are, with how strong Power Word Shield is, or I should say how many active abilities you have, Power Word Life just didn't really seem to be that helpful, that effective. Flash Heal feels ridiculously weak for the spec, and it's like a major like blind spot for the spec. At the moment in dungeons, you're like super heavily carried by Power Word Shield, to the point that like just casting Flash Heal with the expectation that you could top somebody, it's just not great. quite honestly, it is just not great. I think on beta, my shields were doing about twice as much as the average Flash Heal. And I was even running with like the Depth of Shadows trait, where your dot damage is increasing the value of your flash heals, and that was not really doing much of anything either. So I still feel like there's blind spots with how many buttons you could have to mess around with in a raiding environment. I do think the lack of independent variable in 5-mans to increase and amplify your atonement healing, still again a major blind spot. And you do have a couple of different like dead talents, especially in the capstone area. One of them is, I believe it's called Make Amends, which gives you atonement extension if you penance offensively for yourself, or if you penance defensively, it extends atonement on the target. Like, it's just like some garbage, absolute garbage talent at the end of the capstone that competes with, hey, your shields are just 50% stronger. Wow, you know. Very, very confusing on some of those. But if this were to get launched today, it'd actually be pretty damn good, and it would be a step up from Shadowlands, which is hard to argue with, right? I do think there's still a little bit more polish that needs to get done before the spec, I would say, is just like fantastic. And I think a lot of that is definitely going to be around this sort of Power Word Shield style, because it's good to have Power Word Shield feel strong, but I don't want to be in Warlords of Draenor again, where I just feel like I'm spamming nothing but shield 24/7 to be able to produce a large quantity of my output. Striking a good balance with atonement healing and making sure atonement still feels valuable has got to be of prime importance for the devs before they finish up tuning, before they finish up class iteration, and they start rolling us out into the new expansion. And unfortunately, time is of the essence, and time is very short, as we only have a couple short months before the Dragonflight expansion launches. So I'm very hopeful. I'm very happy overall with how the spec is going. I don't think it's going into some bad spot, but there's a couple different things that were just immediately noticeable to me with playing the spec and how many years I've been playing the spec that I'd love to see if they could get fixed before Dragonflight goes live. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Let me know what y'all think in the comments down below. And be sure to catch out some of our live streams as well, because we will be streaming as much raid testing as we can once I get back from TwitchCon. All right, thank you so much for watching. Hope you all enjoyed it. I'll catch y'all next time.